looking at ethics in psychology. So when we're talking about ethics, we're really looking at the role of the British Psychological Society, or the BPS, and their code of ethics, and also the ethical issues that might arise in the design and conduct of psychological research. And we'll also be looking at ways of dealing with these ethical issues also. So, the British Psychological Society, this is the organisation that is responsible for the accreditation and the monitoring of psychologists in this country. And they've outlined 4 ethical principles, which are the main domains of responsibility for consideration by researchers. So the 4 domains are respect, competence, responsibility, and integrity. And I'd really urge you to have a look at the BPS Code of Ethics and their guidelines on the BPS website. And you can click this link here, that will take you there. The BPS also issue guidelines. The last guidelines that were published were in 2018. And the guidelines lay out the issues and the rules that researchers should consider when they plan and run research. So the list that you see here, 1 to 6, is only a summary. These are the main considerations. And these are all built around those 4 main principles that we saw on the previous slide. The ethical guidelines are a sort of quasi-legal document, I guess. So researchers have a professional duty to observe these when conducting research. They won't be sent to prison, but they will lose their job and they'll lose their BPS accreditation and they'll no longer be able to conduct psychological research in this country. So researchers really have a professional duty to observe these. The guidelines are implemented by an ethics committee, and we'll look at this a little bit later on, but when a researcher proposes a research design to the ethics committee, they use a cost-benefit approach to determine whether that study is ethically sound and whether it's acceptable for it to go ahead. And so we're going to be looking at each of these ethical guidelines in turn, and we'll be looking at ways to ensure that they're upheld when conducting research. So the first one is informed consent. It's really important that any prospective participants know what they're getting themselves into before they get themselves into it. So we need to consider whether participants have given informed consent. It's not enough for them to just say, yes, I'm going to take part. It must be informed, which means that they must understand all aspects of the research before they take part. We need to consider if the participant is under 16 years old, in which case informed consent has to be given by a parent or a guardian. So we deal with this by giving participants a consent letter at the beginning of the research. So before they have undertaken any element of the procedure, they're given a document which outlines all the relevant information, and you'll see what this contains on the next slide. So they must be given a consent letter outlining all aspects of the research, and they must be given the choice to take part. So informed consent must be given without any coercion or without any obligation to participants to take part or not. So I just want you to stop and really think about this. How might a participant's right to informed consent conflict with a researcher's need to authentic behaviour from participants? We've spoken about this a little bit previously in the course when we've looked at, for example, covert observations. And so I want you just to consider how here we deal with the needs of the researcher for authentic data against the needs of the participants for informed consent. So here we've got some of the possible information that needs to be included on a consent form. So participants must read this and must sign it under no coercion before the study begins. So they must be made aware of the true aims of the study if possible. If that's not possible, for example, in a covert observation, or perhaps in a study where there is some sort of deception, because telling the participants the true aims would create demand characteristics that might affect our data and make it less reliable. They must be explained. It must be explained to participants briefly what's going to happen. So, for example, outlining the procedure, what's going to be expected of them throughout the experiment. They'll be told what's going to happen with their data and how their information is going to be kept confidential. They're going to be told about their right to withdraw at any time. So they can withdraw their participation by walking away. They can withdraw their data at any point before publication of the study. And they don't need to explain why. They can just walk away. They need to be given a chance to ask any questions. And crucially, in terms of the structure of a consent form, there needs to be a space for them to sign and date. So here you've got an example of a consent form. You'll see that this is from Zimbardo's study on prison life. Here we've got room for a date and the name of the participant. Here they're stating their name. Here as well. Here is an outline of the study, what it's going to involve, any potential harms that are going to come to them. And here we've got room for signature from themselves and also a witness as well. It's possible that in an exam you might be asked to write a consent form for a study, and so it's important you know the information that must be included. So, how do we deal with informed consent and make sure that it is that we're abiding by this guideline? So, participants need to be issued with that consent letter that we saw on the previous slide. If they agree with all of the expectations, then they sign the letter. If they're under 16, then a parent or guardian signs the letter on their behalf. If we cannot have participants grant consent without affecting the integrity of the study, so if we're trying to conduct a covert experiment, or if we need to deceive our participants about the true aims in order to gather authentic data, there are some other ways that we can gather consent. We can gather prior general consent, so we can ask participants beforehand if they would agree to a study that would contain deception, or we might get our participants to agree to a number of different studies, one of which they're actually taking part in, which could be a way to sort of disguise the true aims of this study that they are actually taking part in. We might gather presumptive consent, so we might ask a similar group of people to the participants if they would be happy to take part, and if they say yes, we can assume then that our participants would also agree. We can gather retrospective consent, and so we can ask our participants after the study if they would agree to their data being included. So, for example, we might observe children in the playground and then afterwards ask their parents if they're happy for their children's data to be included. And another way is through debriefing. So this is particularly important if we haven't been able to gather informed consent at the beginning. We need to fully debrief our participants and tell them all details of the study at the end. More on debriefing later. Our next ethical issue is deception. Deception involves deliberately withholding information from participants or perhaps misleading participants at any point of our study. So we need to ask ourselves, have participants received adequate information when they agreed to take part? Have participants been deceived in any way? And if so, could this have been avoided? So deception should be avoided if possible, but of course sometimes it's often necessary for realistic investigations, like with covert observations. We might need to tell them that the research is about X when really it's about Y, because telling them it was about X would influence their behaviour. For example, telling participants that you're going to be observing manners at school is going to make them more polite on those days that they're being observed. So in this case, we might tell them that we're observing teachers' behaviour in a classroom. And this way we're likely to gather authentic data. But we've deceived our participants at this point, and that's necessary for our investigation. Our next ethical principle is protection from harm, and this is a really big one, and a lot of research that we look at, particularly in social psychology, fails to protect participants from harm, and this includes both physical and psychological harm. So we can't abuse or torture our participants, but we also shouldn't cause them embarrassment or undue stress or pressure. Embarrassment can occur when participants have been deceived and the true aims of the study have been revealed. They might get quite embarrassed that they behaved in a particular way, for example. And the key here is that they mustn't be placed at any more risk than they would be in their daily lives. So it's fine to conduct an experiment where a parent is asked to leave the room and the baby is left alone. This is going to make them distressed and this is going to make them cry, perhaps. But this isn't any more distressing than that baby would be put under in everyday life. Parents leave the room and children are left alone. And so in that case, it's considered ethical because they're not at any more risk than they would be in their daily lives. So how do we deal then with deception and protection from harm? Most of this comes from the debriefing that occurs at the end of the study. So in bold here, you can see what must be included in the debriefing. This is usually a document as well as a discussion with the researcher. So we need to reveal the true aims of the study. Particularly if deception occurred, they need to know what the study was really investigating. They need to know what condition of the experiment they were in, And they should also be told what other conditions of the experiment existed. This might not be necessary if, for example, participants were in the control condition and the other participants received caffeine. It might not be necessary to tell them that other people received caffeine, but you generally would as a researcher. If there was another condition, participants should be given the option to take part in that other condition. For example, if they were in a control condition and there was an experimental condition where participants received therapy, then it would be necessary for the researcher to offer participants in the control condition that therapy, particularly if the findings suggested that that therapy was successful and effective. It wouldn't be fair to not offer that therapy to our control participants. We need to remind our participants what the data is going to be used for and their right to confidentiality and how that's going to be maintained. We need to give them the right to withdraw their data. And so at this point, particularly if they've been deceived, they need to be told that their data can be withdrawn from the overall pool of data. So particularly important if the researcher has used deception or general prior consent or presumptive consent rather than informed consent. They need to be reassured that their behaviour was normal and typical, and they need to be provided with contact information of researchers if they've got any further questions after they leave. Now, this last one isn't always necessary, but if it's been sort of a sensitive topic or you're researching clinically vulnerable people, then you need to provide them with helpline support details. And so they might need counselling following the conclusion of the study, but that is rare. Right to withdraw. Here we need to consider whether participants have been informed of their right to withdraw from the research at any point, and this includes withdrawing their data. And so at any point, right up to the date of publication, participants can choose to have their data excluded. And this is even more relevant nowadays with the Data Protection Act of 2018. You, as a European citizen, have the right to own your own data, and you have the right for companies to delete your data, and this includes psychological researchers. So, how do we deal with the right to withdraw? So, prior to the study, participants need to be told that they can withdraw from at any time without needing to give a reason. They need to be reminded during the instructions. It must be noted again in the debriefing form that they've got a right to withdraw data even after the conclusion of the study. And we need to consider how offering a financial reward can conflict with this. So quite often, in order to recruit participants, researchers pay them some sort of nominal fee or might give them an Amazon voucher, for example. But we need to make sure that participants still receive this voucher or money even if they withdraw their data, because it could be coercive if we say participants only get that reward if they finish the study. And so we need to consider how we could reward participants for taking part without punishing those that withdraw. So if you receive £10 on completion of the study, that would be considered unethical. And likewise, we can't bribe participants. Confidentiality, so this refers to participants' right to remain anonymous. We need to make sure that the confidentiality is maintained, and this is enshrined in law under that Data Protection Act. This is critical to protect participants from harm from embarrassment or perhaps persecution if their individual results are published. And this has to occur in all studies, particularly in when harm may arise to participants or perhaps somebody associated with the participant. So, how do we deal with confidentiality? We must make sure that participants' personal details are protected at all costs. We never reveal the name or address or any other personal information of participants. And sometimes this means that we can't release where a particular study was conducted. So, for example, if I was conducting research on psychology students, I wouldn't want to publish the fact that it was conducted with students at Caterham School, because then people can very easily find out who studied psychology at Caterham in that year, and then your data is not protected. When we're conducting case studies, you will know that we use initials like KF or HM, and this is to protect their identity. We always assign a participant an ID number, and so whenever we're dealing with data, we're not linking anyone's data to a name, we're just linking their data to a participant ID. So this is just ensuring another step towards confidentiality. We keep the list of IDs and the ID numbers linked to the participants in a different secure locked location. And so the researchers will very, very rarely need to ever actually match up a participant's ID number to their name. This might occur, for example, if we're doing a follow-up study and we obviously need to track down participants in the future, but generally we don't need to link individual participants' ID to the participant's name. During the briefing and the debriefing, we need to remind participants their data is going to be protected. And as we just mentioned, if a study requires some sort of follow-up in the future, then we can't keep the anonymity. We need to link IDs to names, but we still need to take steps to ensure confidentiality. So, as I mentioned right at the beginning of this video, in order to get your research the go-ahead, you need to have it accepted by an ethics committee. So most universities will have an ethics committee, and they review research, not just psychological research, but all research to determine whether it is ethically sound. And they follow this cost-benefit analysis approach. And so they consider the benefits, so for example, the value or the groundbreaking nature of the research and how beneficial it would be to society, against the costs, perhaps the damaging effects on the individual participants, or perhaps the reputation of psychology as a whole. And this is really highlighting the conflict between the rights of the participants and the needs of the researcher to produce authentic and worthwhile data. And so they will weigh up these benefits and the costs and ultimately decide whether a study is ethically sound and should be approved. So in lessons this week, you're going to be looking at a number of studies, and you're going to be applying this cost-benefit approach to determine whether the psychological research should be approved.